Hey everyone,
Hey guys.
welcome to another Travel Therapy Mentor video. Tonight we're going to be talking about the actual logistics of signing a contract, what you should look for in your contract. We've talked the last few months about contracts in general, finding contracts, getting started, first day, all that stuff. But it's been a few years now since we last talked about what you should actually look for in a contract. Very often we get questions about people's travel assignments. They'll send us a message on Instagram or an email and they'll ask, and very often the answer is, oh, well, what does your contract say? And I think often people don't realize that it's very important to review your contract, make sure everything looks right before you sign it. A lot of people are just taking the recruiter's word for it, signing the contract, not even reading through it. So we want to talk a little bit about what you should look for in a contract and make sure that before you sign a contract, you're checking and making sure everything looks right. So Whitney's going to introduce us and then we'll jump into the topic.
All right, hey guys, a lot of you probably already know us and have tuned in for our videos in the past, but if you haven't, we are Whitney and Jared Kazaza, and we're both traveling doctors of physical therapy. We've been traveling physical therapists since we were both new grads in 2015. And back then there wasn't a lot of information out there for travel therapists specifically. So over the years, we've done a lot of education in the space about travel therapy and different various topics. So if you are new to our page or new to our channel, definitely go back and listen to some of our old videos, podcasts, check out our website, traveltherapymentor.com, where we've got just tons of information about almost every topic you can think of regarding travel therapy. It's been years ago that we first wrote an article and did a video about what to look for on your contract, as Jared mentioned, but we thought it was time to bring that back around and bring up some key points that you need to be looking for on your written contract. Some of these key points you will have already discussed verbally before ever seeing the written contract. Quite often you do kind of verbally accept the basic terms of a contract, like the location and the start and end date after you've done your interview and the rough pay package. But when it comes to the actual written contract, you need to make sure everything is in writing as discussed before proceeding with the actual job. So that's what we're going to dive into today.
A lot of the stuff we're going to cover is very similar to the last video we did, but there are some new things. Most of the stuff is evergreen. It doesn't really change much, but there are some new things companies are doing that we've heard about recently that we're going to cover as well.
Yeah, and just a couple quick announcements before we dive into tonight's topic. If you guys are not following us on Instagram already, I know we are live today on both Instagram and Facebook, so some of you are coming at us from Instagram and some of you will listen on Facebook, YouTube, or podcast. We are currently doing a giveaway on our Instagram page. It will be ending tomorrow, which will be Monday, July the 29th. So if you haven't yet, make sure to go to enter to win that giveaway. Two people are going to win two awesome prizes. One is an Apple Watch and one is a Hatch alarm clock. So definitely get your name in the hat for those drawings, and we'll randomly choose the winners tomorrow and announce it on our Instagram page.
Another announcement, we are doing our end of the year giveaway again. We've done that, I think, 3 years now. We're giving away $1,200 in gift cards this year. So if you've completed a contract with one of our recruiters, that's the main thing that we end up giving gift cards for. We give 5 $200 gift cards to people that have completed a contract with our recruiters. Mainly the reason for doing this is we want to try to get feedback about the recruiters that we send you guys to. We've got over 50 recruiters now. We've got 14 companies that we work with, and the best way that we can make sure they're doing a good job is to get feedback from people that take contracts with these recruiters, get in touch with them. So we want as much feedback as we can get, and the way to incentivize that is to give away $1,000 in gift cards.
Yeah, we really want to make sure that we're giving the best recommendations to you all. We have vetted every recruiter that we work with and that we recommend to you. We do try to hold them accountable, but we definitely want to hear from you guys how things are going after we give our recommendation and you start working with them. We really value that feedback. So if you have taken a contract with one of our recruiters this year, make sure to go onto our website. I believe the webpage is traveltherapymentor.com/giveaway, or if you just go to our website and click on the menu, the drop down, it'll say giveaway, and you can enter the details of your contract and give us some feedback about the recruiter that you were matched with. And that really helps us out, and then you'll get entered to win a $200 gift card at the end of the year. If that's something you're interested in getting involved with, if you want to get recruiter recommendations from us, you can fill out our recruiter recommendation form on our website, or it also goes if you contact us about one of the hot jobs on our page and end up taking a job with one of the recruiters that way, you'll also become eligible after you complete at least a 13-week contract. So definitely check that out if you haven't gotten entered to win that giveaway. We'll also do giveaways at the end of the year for just folks that leave us reviews, either on Apple Podcasts or on our Facebook page, so feel free to leave us a review and send us a screenshot. Then you can get entered to win a $100 gift card for that. And then one person from our travel therapy course will also win a $100 gift card for leaving us a review on the course. So make sure to get entered to win those. It's hard to believe we're already in the second half of the year, and it'll be here in no time that we're doing those end of the year giveaways.
Yep. So far, we've only got 20 people that have filled out that end of the year giveaway form. So odds are really good right now. Usually we have 150 or so that fill it out. So still, if you fill it out right now, you have a pretty good chance of winning.
Yeah. And then the last announcement is we are getting ready to go on another trip. We're going to be leaving on Tuesday to go to Colorado. So feel free to follow along with us on our Instagram and Facebook pages for some of the fun stuff that we're going to do in Colorado. We're taking a little road trip all around the state. So we've been to Colorado several times before, but we're hopefully going to do and see some new stuff. So lots of fun stuff to share there. This will be a different type of trip because I'm 6 months pregnant. So hopefully the trip goes well and traveling goes well. It's been a little while since we've taken a trip, so it should be fun. But we'll dive into tonight's topic. If you are watching live on either Facebook or Instagram, we would just love if you'd say hi in the comments and let us know that you're watching. Also, feel free to ask any questions if you're on live. You can ask in the comment box and we'll answer either throughout the video or at the end.
Allie says she's in Odessa, Texas, just started an 8-week contract this past week. That's good.
Awesome.
Hopefully it's going well.
Yeah.
I don't know much about Odessa. I don't think we've ever been through there.
Yeah. Texas is a huge place. And then hey to all of you that are tuning in on Instagram as well.
All right, so like we said, reviewing your contract is really important. Very often, a lot of issues that you have that might arise on a travel contract, it will be resolved based on what was in the contract. So things like putting in your notice or hourly guarantees, guaranteed stipends, start end dates, locations, all that stuff's in the contract. So it's really important to make sure that what your recruiters told you, what you interviewed the job for, that it all matches what it actually says in the contract. Because I would say 90% of the time it will. You can trust your recruiter on that. But there are definitely times that if you're working with a recruiter from a company that's not great or the recruiter is a little shady, they can try to change things. Maybe like change the pay a little bit less or change days off or those types of things. So it's always really important just to check what that you agreed to is what's actually written before you ever sign this contract.
Yeah, and there's just countless examples where something has come up where somebody missed an error on the contract and then it really came back to bite them. For example, as we get into talking about these specific topics, I can specifically remember one of the issues that I ran into in one of my contracts was I didn't realize that they had my tax home information incorrect. And I actually ended up getting fully taxed for my first few weeks of my contract, and I didn't pay very close attention to what was going into my bank account because I also had 401k deductions and things like that. And so it wasn't until like a few weeks in that I realized that my paycheck was lower than what it was supposed to be. And then when I went back and checked, I realized they were actually taxing me on all this stuff because they didn't have my tax home information in there correctly. And so it was this whole thing that could have been avoided had I caught that initially on the contract. So there's just countless examples where we've also heard of issues with like, well, I thought it was this, but apparently in the contract they wrote this, and then now you're kind of in a bad situation. So super important.
Yeah, and often we'll get people that say, well, my recruiter said this, and then we say, okay, what does the contract say? And it says something different. And they say, well, have it in writing in email. What you have to remember is what you sign in that contract holds a lot more weight than what the recruiter said to you on the phone or was in an email or what you talked to the manager at the facility about on the phone. All of those things, they can kind of say whatever they want. What really matters is what's actually written down and signed in the contract.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about some things that you might see on your contract. So just getting into the basics, you want to make sure that your name and your contact information is spelled correctly, that all that is correct on there. Your name, your address, date of birth, if that happens to be on there. Just want to make sure all that stuff is correct. Don't need to get into anything silly because they spelled your name wrong.
The next thing is make sure that the start and end dates are what you agreed to. That's one of the things that's most often wrong because travel contracts are often ASAP starts, so they want you to start as soon as possible. It can be a situation where you agree to a certain date and that information gets lost in translation somewhere between the facility manager or the owner that you talk to, and then how it gets back to the recruiter, and then the contract is wrong. So make sure that the start and end dates are correct because often that can be messed up.
Yeah, we actually just heard from a traveler recently who she did check her contract, and her contract did say the start date was such and such, and she went ahead and drove all the way across the country and arrived to the location only to find out that the facility was under the impression that she wasn't supposed to start until the next week. And so this goes back to not only checking your contract, but making sure to get accurate first day instructions when discussing things with both your recruiter and the facility to make sure that all of you are on the same page. Because you definitely don't want to drive across the country and have the wrong start date and then go a week or more without pay.
Yeah, it can feel like you're being annoying sometimes, making sure, double, triple checking, but it is well worth it to not have a situation where you miss a week or two of work just because something was overlooked. So don't feel like you're being annoying by double checking with the recruiter, with the manager, making sure everything's set to go like a week in advance, just so you know that you're not going to make this trip for no reason or be stuck somewhere for a week without work.
Yeah, so check your start and end dates. Next, lots of things to say here about checking the pay. And someone just commented on Instagram, Jared Thomas on Instagram says, the recruiters will also try to trick you up with gross versus net pay. Sometimes they might be trying to trick you, or other times that's just the way that their company standard is to discuss it with gross pay. The majority of recruiters that we have always worked with in travel therapy do discuss pay as like a rough estimate of what your net pay is going to be. But it is so important that sometimes they're just giving you a ballpark estimate of what the after-tax pay would be. So when you're chatting with them about the job, they're like, yes, this job is going to pay roughly, $19.50 a week after taxes. But when it finally comes down to seeing the breakdown of how your pay package is exactly going to look, it's really important that you check all the numbers and run the calculations yourself to make sure it adds up to roughly what you had agreed upon, and make sure to understand the difference between gross and net pay.
Yeah, the gross and net pay thing, we made a video maybe a year ago or something about that, and it's only gotten more confusing since then because therapy traditionally has always talked about pay in terms of net pay. The whole time we've been in it, 10 years, everyone has always talked about pay in terms of net pay. On the other hand, the nursing world has always talked about pay in terms of gross pay. Why that is, I don't know. But now there's so many nursing companies getting into therapy, more than ever. There's right now, probably every week, at least a few new nursing companies trying to get into therapy. So they bring the therapy or the nursing world into therapy a little bit. So now it's more and more common to see pay quoted as gross pay. And it's not that they're trying to mislead you or anything, it's just what they're used to. So there are situations where they can try to mislead you, but often it's just a miscommunication. It's a mixing of two worlds that normally haven't been together.
Yeah. If you are newer to understanding travel therapy and you haven't taken a contract yet, we highly recommend that you read our articles where we have some really detailed articles explaining how to understand a travel therapy pay package, how to understand the hourly, the stipend, what's net pay, how do you calculate it if they give you the gross pay, and all of that. There is a website that we like to use to run the calculations, especially when it comes to looking at our contract and making sure that the net pay is what we're expecting, and that's called paycheckcity.com, I believe. Is that the address? Yep. And so you can kind of run it based on your state and your tax bracket to make sure that it's what was discussed. So what it's going to look like on your contract is usually they'll list the hourly pay. So for a lot of times, like with a PTOT or speech therapist, it's going to be about $20 an hour. Some companies do a little lower on the hourly. We have seen $15 or $18 an hour. Some do a little higher, $22, $25 an hour, but somewhere in that range, typically between like $15 and $25 an hour.
I think more commonly these days it's around 20 to 25.
Yep. So you're going to see your hourly pay listed. And then next you're going to see your stipends listed. Now, some companies list stipends differently. They might call it per diem, they might call it stipends. They might say your reimbursement for lodging, lodging, meals, and incidentals. All of this terminology is the same thing. It's all talking about that hopefully tax-free stipend that you're going to be receiving if you're meeting all the tax term rules. Again, if you're kind of newer to travel therapy and you're not understanding some of the stuff that we're talking about here, you'll need to dig into understanding the pay packages and the tax term rules. But we're just kind of talking about what you're going to see on the contract. Hourly pay, and then in some way you're going to see the stipends. Sometimes they'll list it as per week, sometimes they'll list it per hour. So you might have
sometimes it can be per day.
Per day, yeah. So sometimes you're just going to have to run the calculations based on how they have it listed. And if you have questions, you can always go back to your recruiter to be like, can you explain to me the way this is broken down, and what's the best way to calculate this to know, like, what's my paycheck actually going to be, right?
Yep. Another thing that'll be on there is your reimbursements. Sometimes for things like licenses, for any kind of like pre-employment testing or things that you had to do, background checks, drug tests, those types of things. Also for travel to and from your travel assignment, often you'll get some sort of reimbursement for that. It might be $200 on the way there, $200 on the way back, something like that. So check and make sure anything that you agreed upon in terms of reimbursements, travel allowances, that is included in the contract as well.
Yeah, and you'd like to see how it's listed. You want to make sure that your expectations are in check with what they have listed, because sometimes they'll say something like travel reimbursement to be paid on last paycheck, or sometimes it'll say to be paid on second paycheck. So you need to kind of know, like, when am I going to get this money? They don't always list that, but some companies will. Sometimes they'll break the travel up into like a beginning and an ending travel. Sometimes it'll just be a lump sum. Sometimes it's based on, typically it's based on mileage. Typically it's going to be based on the mileage from your starting point to your ending point, but not always. So again, just look for all these things and make sure it is what was discussed. And then you're going to want to run the calculations to figure out the after-tax pay and make sure it is what was discussed.
Yep. Another thing in terms of pay to look at is overtime and holiday pay rates, and if there's any differences there. So the standard, obviously, for all of the world is time and a half for overtime. For travel, that gets a little weird because our taxable rate is so low. So very often you can negotiate a much higher than time and a half hourly rate. This depends on the travel company. Depends on the specific contract. Sometimes it's very easy to negotiate a really high overtime rate. We've seen overtime rates of $80 or $90 an hour. Sometimes they push back a lot, and maybe the highest they'll go is like $35, $40 an hour. It just really depends on the company and what you can negotiate there. Very often it won't matter. It's not that many travel contracts that want you to get overtime or will allow it, but there are some out there that will. I've worked a lot of overtime in the past, so if there's any chance, like you're working 40 hours a week and there's a chance that you're going to get overtime, then make sure that your overtime rate is something that you're comfortable with. And when you get the contract, if you get it and it's just time and a half, try to negotiate that higher, get something that seems more reasonable, more worth your time.
Yeah, we have run into a situation where some companies won't list a higher overtime rate. We've had to negotiate something else because they have a very standard like legal department, and they're like, no, like we're only allowed to do time and a half based on the hourly. And so if that was the case, we were like, okay, well, what if we end up getting overtime? Is there a way to negotiate some type of other overtime bonus? So just make sure to have that conversation if you think there's any chance based on, for example, your conversation with the facility. If it sounds like they're extremely short-staffed and they might end up needing you extra hours, definitely have that discussion with your recruiter about the overtime pay. Same goes for holiday pay. It kind of depends on the time of year and the type of facility you're going to be working in. If you're going to be working in the summer or something where there's like not a lot of holidays to take into consideration, maybe don't worry about it. But if you know for a fact you're working through lots of holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Christmas Eve, New Year's Day, find out about what the holiday pay situation is and the holiday closure situation. So is it an outpatient clinic where you're just going to be closed on those days and you're not going to get paid anyway? Or are you working in a hospital where they actually are going to require you to work some of the holidays? So take that into consideration when it comes to looking at your contract.
So along the same lines, Woody mentioned this a little bit earlier, but also will affect your pay is very often travel companies now will have you sign a declaration stating that you have a travel contract, a tax home, sorry. Sometimes that will be in the contract itself. Sometimes it'll be a separate thing that they send you to sign. And basically the reason they do that is to push the liability from them to you. So if you say, yes, I have a tax home, and then eventually later down the line you get audited or they get audited and the IRS follows up and you didn't have a tax home, well, they can say, well, they told us they did, we did our due diligence, they signed, so they had it. That's their way of covering themselves. So very often that will be in the contract or a separate form that you have to sign.
Yeah, so check just to see in your contract. Not always will it be there, but sometimes there might be some terminology about whether your stipends are going to be received tax-free versus not. Just kind of assess for that and make sure. And obviously, of course, when it comes to getting your first paycheck, make sure to go back and look at your contract and look at your paycheck and see if it was what was agreed upon. And if there's any discrepancy your first week, make sure to get it addressed as early as possible. Yep. Don't be like me and wait till several weeks in and then realize that you're out a bunch of money.
Yep. I saw that we got a couple questions. If you guys have any additional questions on either Facebook or Instagram, feel free to ask those. We'll go through all that we have here, and then we'll go back to your questions at the end.
Yeah, and if you are watching live, again, we would just love if you'd say hi in the comments and let us know if you're a current traveler, if you're someone who's thinking about traveling. We'd love to hear from you. Also hit that thumbs up button if you are learning something and enjoying this content.
So the next thing you want to look at is any time off requests that you made. So very often you'll have, say, a holiday you need to go to, or a wedding or something like that, and you'll have some days you need off. Make sure that's written in the contract if that's something that you need. If those dates aren't in there, then it's very likely that it could be difficult to get that time off approved later on. So
Yeah.
have that in there up front. Make sure anytime you need off is listed in the contract before you ever sign it.
Yeah, this is something that's a little bit different than with a permanent job. So typically there's not necessarily PTO included with travel therapy, and typically because you're such a short-term employee, they like for you to ask for the time off in advance and have it agreed upon. Rather than just springing it on them, because you're not in their normal system for requesting PTO and all that stuff. So it's not really good to be, 4 weeks into your contract and then be like, by the way, I need to ask off for this week coming up. It's better if you know in advance to ask off in advance and get it approved in advance and put in the contract. Now, there are certain situations where you might not know, and maybe you're like, well, I might want some days off. We have definitely heard of some companies working into the contract some terminology to leave it kind of open-ended. So we've seen some terminology to say something like time off requests, 2 days off during contract to be determined at a later date, agreed upon at least 2 weeks in advance, or something like that. Or maybe you're taking a 6-month contract and you want to take a whole week off, or 2 long weekends, or whatever you're wanting to negotiate in there, try to get it written in advance. So then if your manager later on is like, you're a contractor, I can't give you this time off, you can be like, well, it is in my contract. It says if I give you 2 weeks in advance notice, then you have to give me the day off. So just try to work that out with your recruiter. Try to anticipate your needs. Now, of course, if it is something that comes up during your contract where like you're sick or there's an emergency, usually facilities are pretty lenient in giving you the time off that you need, unpaid, of course. But if at all possible, try to get it written in advance.
Another thing you want to check is the facility location. This is something that we've seen people have issues with in the past, where they interview for a job, the manager says, oh yeah, it's this location. They are under the assumption they're only going to work at that one location, and then they get the contract, they don't look, they sign it, and it says like 2 or 3 locations. So this can happen sometimes with nursing facilities that might have multiple locations in different cities, say 30 minutes away, and it might be like, oh, but sometimes you'll have to float to this place or this place, so it might have multiple locations listed. Just make sure, like, if that's something you agree to, great, but make sure that if you only agreed to work in one facility, that there's only one facility listed. If there's multiple, then that means they're going to expect you to jump around from place to place, and that may or may not be something that you want to do.
Yeah, so check to see if it just says like the general company name, or does it say a specific address. It's not uncommon for it to just say the general company name, but most of the time it should have an address in there. Make sure that's the address, the location that you did agree to go to.
Another thing is the cancellation policy. This is probably the most common thing that people have issues with. So very often, if you want to end your contract early, or the facility wants to end your contract early, you'll either have to give 14 days or 30 days notice for that. And what depends on whether it's 14 days or 30 days is what's written in the contract. Often we tell people to try to get 30 days if possible, because it's much more likely that the facility is going to want to end your contract than it is that you're going to want to end the contract if you're a normal traveler. So you want to have as much time, if that happens, if the facility wants to get rid of you, you want to have as much time as possible to find another contract. Otherwise, you're going to be left without work for a while. 14 days can be pretty tough. It's just 2 weeks for you to, find another contract, pack all your stuff, move. It can be difficult to do that. It's like kind of a scramble. Whereas if you have an entire month, it's much easier to either find something in the area, find housing, move, all that stuff. So 30 days usually makes more sense. Sometimes facilities won't agree to that though. So sometimes they'll only agree to 14 days. But just make sure that whatever you want, whatever you've agreed to, that's listed, and you're not expecting it to be 30 days and then it says 14, because that does happen pretty often.
Yeah, we usually try to push for 30 if possible, but there are pros and cons here, because sometimes if you have a 30-day notice but you end up at a contract that you really hate, that feels like a really long time to have to stay there. If you really don't like it, you would rather get out of it earlier. So there's definitely situations here, we get questions about this all the time, where people arrive there and it's not what they expected, and they're like, can I get out of this contract earlier than what it says on my cancellation policy? If you are put in a situation that is unethical or illegal, there is definitely cause for you to terminate immediately or sooner than your notice. And that's something you'll discuss with your recruiter and work out. And from what we understand, there's never been any legal repercussions in that situation if you have good cause. We don't recommend taking this lightly. You shouldn't just be canceling contracts left and right because it's just, you don't really like it. But if you are in a very bad ethical or legal dilemma, there are situations where you can get out of it earlier. There's also situations where they might cancel you on the spot, cancel you earlier. Again, I think part of this, you might be able to go into a little more detail, Jared, about the at-will employment and all that sort of thing. It's a bummer, and we've had a lot of people come to us and be like, is there any legal standing for this? They just told me that today was my last day, even though they were supposed to give this notice. And so there's definitely certain situations where either you or they won't uphold the notice, but we do try to go off it as much as possible.
Very often when they just end your contract abruptly without notice, it is something to do with an ethical concern that they have. So same as like you could have issues like, say they're trying to triple book people that should not be triple booked, or they're trying to do groups with people that shouldn't be in groups, and you have ethical issues with that. There are therapists that the companies will have issues with, like, say we've had crazy situations we've heard of in the past where like people come to work drunk or something like that. Like, then obviously the facility is going to have an issue with that, and they're going to get rid of you right away. They have the right to do that in a situation that is also has to do with ethical concerns or patient safety type things. But the vast majority of the time, they're going to go with what the cancellation policy is in the contract. So just make sure that is what you're expecting it to be.
Yeah. We also did recently review a contract that a therapist sent to us from a different staffing company that we'd never worked with before, and we saw some interesting terminology in there. This was our first time ever seeing this terminology. And it put the therapist in a really bad situation. So there was actually terminology in her contract that said that she had to give a notice of whatever it was, 30 days or whatever, but the facility did not. That the facility could terminate on the spot. And I was like, wow, that is very interesting. I've never seen that before.
We've only seen that one time ever, but you do not want to have a contract that has that written in it. So if you get sent a contract by a recruiter that says something about they can cancel you with no notice at all and you have to give 30 days, don't sign that for sure. You want to have some sort of protection, minimum 14 days, ideally 30 days, to make sure that you're able to find another contract if they don't need you.
Yeah. The next thing we're going to look for in the contract is, are there any guaranteed hours? So guaranteed hours means that regardless of hours worked, they're going to pay you for X number of hours guaranteed. Ideally, if you're signing up to work at a facility with the expectation you're going to work 40 hours and they're going to schedule you 40 hours, ideally you get what's called a 40-hour guarantee, where they will always pay you for 40 no matter what, no matter if like you get done early one day or whatever. There are some facilities that won't guarantee 40. Maybe they'll only guarantee 36. That's kind of common. And in certain settings, like I think in the school system, I think it's typically more like a 32-hour guarantee. So it just depends on the facility, depends on the setting. But if at all possible, try to see if you can get that 40-hour guarantee, because that gives you a lot more protection, and also know what to expect for your weekly paycheck. That means you're always going to get paid for the full 40 hours no matter what, even if census is low or your caseload drops off or whatever, or inclement weather and you go home for the day or whatever. So try to get that 40-hour guarantee if you can, but just check to see if there's something in there. Rarely will it be a situation where there's no guarantee. Those are really bad situations to be in, because say you think that you're going to get paid X amount, but then you get there and your caseload is only 50% and they're sending you home early every day and you only end up working 25 hours, and now you're only getting paid for 25 hours. So always make sure there's some kind of guarantee, ideally a 40-hour guarantee.
Yeah. And obviously, if you're somebody like us that's working part-time contracts, it can vary drastically. It can be a 16-hour guarantee for us if we're working 2 days, or it can be a 24-hour guarantee, 32, 40. All that depends on what your needs are, what the facility wants, and what you're comfortable with. But you definitely don't want to be expecting to work 40 hours and then go into a contract with no guarantee where you could be working 10 hours. You have no idea. And that also goes to another point that you sometimes will see in contracts. There's a difference between guaranteed hours and expected hours. Often a contract will say expected hours 40, guaranteed like 32 or 24 or something like that. That means like they're going to schedule you 9 to 5 or whatever, like normal work hours. But if they don't need you for all those hours, they can send you home, and then you're only actually guaranteed that lower amount. So just because your contract says expected 40, that doesn't mean that you're going to get 40. You want to look for an actual guarantee hour clause or something in there that shows what you're going to get and what you can, if you were, let's say you sign a contract that says guaranteed hours 32, but expected 40. Okay, well, you have to understand that you might only get paid for 32, so all your budgeting and everything should be based around, I might only get 32. If everything goes well, then I'll get 40, but I need to make sure I can make do on 32 in case that's a situation.
Yeah, extremely important that you look for that word that says guarantee, hourly guarantee, guaranteed hours. Some companies call it a guaranteed work week, abbreviated GWW. So look for that guarantee. If you're confused or you're not really seeing it somewhere, check with your recruiter to see if maybe you're just overlooking it or they forgot to put it in there, or it might raise a red flag to you to be like, oh, apparently there was never a guarantee. I was just under the assumption there was. Try to get that guarantee worked in, because we can't tell you how many people have come to us and said, like, they told me I was going to be making $2,000 a week, but consistently my paychecks are only $1,750, and it's like, well, are you working for a full 40 hours? And it's like, no, they've been sending me home early. So like Jared said, you have to know like what's the low end of what you're going to be guaranteed to make every week versus the high end if assuming you have a full caseload.
Yeah, and when you're quoted pay, if it's expected 40 hours, the recruiter's going to quote you pay based on working 40 hours, because they also hope that you work 40 hours. They only get paid based on the hours you work, the company. So if you're working less than what is expected and you don't have a guarantee for the number of expected hours, then you're going to make less money. And so, I think most people understand that, but sometimes people do get confused with that.
Yeah. You also want to check and see what is considered included in the guaranteed hours, because sometimes there will be specific terminology to say that your guaranteed hours do not apply on holiday weeks. In case of inclement weather, we've seen some terminology that said if there's just like an act of God, for example,
which was COVID.
So when COVID happened, a lot of them enacted this act of God clause where they were just like, this was out of our control. We're not paying you. We're not responsible for your guaranteed hours. We've definitely seen it happen sometimes with inclement weather where like, we had a situation one time where there was a bad hurricane and there was flooding and the clinic was closed, and we actually did get paid, but there's certain situations where they wouldn't, or if you get canceled for snow or something like that, there's certain situations where they wouldn't pay for that. So you just want to know what's included, so that way you have expectations in alignment with what's on the contract. It also almost never includes if you request time off. So if you call in sick or you take a day off, your guaranteed hours don't apply in that situation. So that's the general assumption.
Yep. Another thing to look for, I don't think many companies do this anymore, but some companies will guarantee stipends. And so let's say that you're working a contract and the guaranteed hours are only 24. Expected hours are 40, guaranteed hours are 24. And you end up working 32 hours or 36 hours. Some companies will pay you the entire 40 hours of stipends and you just miss out on the taxable portion of your pay. Other companies will prorate all of your pay and your stipends based on the number of hours that was the guarantee or the number of hours that you worked. So if you worked 30 and the expectation was 40, but the guarantee was only 24 or 30, then you're only going to get paid for 30. Whereas other times, some companies, if they guarantee your stipends, they'll pay you that additional 10 hours of stipends, which makes sense because, if you're only working 30 hours or you're only working 24 hours, it's not like you working less hours means you have less expenses in terms of meals, incidentals, and lodging. So there are some companies that will do that, but it's much more rare these days because companies can lose a ton of money in that situation. Just think, like I said, they only get paid for the hours you work. So let's say you only work 24 hours and they pay you your taxable pay for 24 hours and then they pay you 40 hours of stipends. They're losing a lot of money on that. So a lot of companies won't take the risk of guaranteeing stipends anymore, but some still do.
So more often what you're going to see is most companies will basically prorate your pay based on the hours worked, including prorating your stipends. There's different terminology they might include in the contract in order to justify this. We've seen it called a reduced hours fee. We've seen it called an unearned cost of living adjustment. Something to say that if you only work, for example, 36 hours, that they're going to not only reduce your hourly rate by 4 hours, but they're also going to reduce your stipends by dividing 36 out of 40. It definitely is tricky. The reason that some companies don't do it this way is because they've had legal issues in the past where basically they were accused of wage recharacterization and shifting the money around in your pay package, because technically you should be paid full stipends because, like Jared said, your living expenses don't change just because you worked less hours that week. But I would say it is the norm for most companies to actually reduce your pay based on both the hourly and the stipend, depending on how many number of hours you worked.
And it is illegal technically to reduce your stipends, your tax-free amount. And so the way they get around this, like Whitney said, is they'll still pay you your full stipends, but then they charge a fee against the hours you didn't work. So essentially, they're not paying you for it, but it's a fee instead of like subtracting that out. So it's like, oh, we gave you the full stipends, but then we have to charge you this fee, so we subtract some of the money back. So it's a workaround for legal complications.
Yeah. So it's a little tricky here. There's a lot of things to look for in your contract that pertain to your pay to fully understand the way that you're going to be paid each week in every circumstance. So it is very important that on each and every one of these topics that we covered in regards to the way that your contract is going to be written, that you do a little bit more research just to understand the way all this works. You need to really understand the way the pay packages work. You need to understand what guaranteed hours is, what guaranteed stipends is, guaranteed versus expected hours, all those sorts of things. And again, we have some more detailed articles explaining each one of these topics so you can better understand it. The more contracts that you work, the more you're going to understand this. The more conversations you have with your recruiter, the better this will all make sense. But we are just making you aware of, like, these are the things that you need to be paying attention to in your contract and asking questions about so that you don't get taken advantage of. Or sometimes it's not even that you're being taken advantage of, it's just that there was a mistake or a misunderstanding or just some confusion. So the more you learn about this, the less confusion there will be.
Yep.
All right, so we have a few more things. Those are all the basic things that are almost always going to be on your contracts, but we do have a few more things that are sometimes on contracts.
Sometimes you'll have things about your agreed upon schedule, so that can be like maybe work 9 to 5 weekdays, or sometimes your schedule will be like Friday through Monday or something weird like that, 410s, 312s. So any weird thing that you have with your schedule, just make sure that's listed in there. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't, but just make sure that's what you agreed to. And say you agreed to normal hours, and then in the contract it says 10 to 7 or something that you weren't expecting. Just check on that.
Yep. The other thing that we don't often see, but sometimes we see, and I think we got a question about this as well on Instagram about having something written in there about your productivity or your, like, the number of patients. So Jared on Instagram asked, what are your thoughts on putting on X number of patients per day in your contract? I've had some clinics that attract me to the clinic saying that they were going to do 12 patients a day, but then when I start, they actually try to schedule me 20. So in some situations, if that's something that's really important to you that was discussed during the interview, it might be in your benefit to try to get it written into the contract that you're only going to see X number of patients per day. Sometimes they won't write it in the contract, and this is where we encourage you, if that's something you really want to hold them accountable to, at least have it in an email. Have it somewhere in writing that was discussed with your recruiter, that it was discussed with the manager, so that if they try to schedule you more than what you agreed to, you can go back and reference that.
Yeah. On the other hand, though, there are situations where you don't want it written in your contract. And we've seen situations where, say you're taking a skilled nursing contract and it'll say 90% productivity expected. And the reason they write that in there, and often travelers will just sign it and not know anything about it, is if the traveler then only gets 80% productivity, they'll prorate your pay because they'll say, we expected in the contract that you are getting 90% productivity. Anything less than that will prorate your pay and reduce it to account for this unproductive time, essentially. So in those situations, you don't want any productivity written in, because there's obviously going to be situations, some days, like say you have a lot of non-visit discharges or things come up, meetings, whatever it is, that you might not hit that productivity goal and you don't want your pay prorated. But on the other hand, yes, there are situations, say outpatient jobs, where if the clinic says it's going to be one-on-one, you might want to try to get that in writing somehow. If it's in the contract, even better, to make sure that it's not, they're going to say one-on-one and then they end up double booking you several times per day or something like that.
Yeah, and in those cases where we've worked at some skilled nursing facilities where they said, okay, our company-wide standard is this, like say 85 or 90%, we always push back and say, what about the days that X, Y, and Z happen? That's not always realistic. If I'm the only supervising clinician, whether that's the physical therapist, the occupational therapist, or the speech language pathologist, that means I'm doing all the evaluations, all the progress notes, all the discharges, all the research. What if there's a day I have a lot of documentation? We usually try to have this conversation during the phone interview, and the only reason we would ever agree to it is if they are lenient and say like, yeah, it's okay, like our company standard is 90%, but it's fine if some days you're lower, we take that into account. So if that was agreed upon verbally, then I absolutely don't want to sign something that says I'm committing to 90% because I already agreed to this workaround with the manager. So I'm not gonna have that in writing. I would not sign that. I would have them take it off.
Yep. Something else that could potentially be in the contract is information on benefits, 401k, health insurance, that kind of stuff. It might ask for elections on what you're choosing in terms of what benefits you want, what benefits you don't. So just make sure that if that's in there, that it's what you thought it was and what you agreed to before you ever sign it.
Yeah, but it won't always be on there. Sometimes that's just some separate paperwork. But also just keep in mind when you're a newer traveler and you're trying to understand the pay packages and everything, like we already discussed lots of different things in the contract that could make your weekly pay up or down depending on the different factors. Insurance deductions or 401k deductions is a big one that I think a lot of people miss. They don't understand that sometimes when you're newer to travel therapy and you get your first paycheck, you're like, this is lower than what I agreed to, but you forgot to account for the fact that you were electing to have them take out your insurance and your 401k. So just keep that in mind when you do start to see your first paycheck. If it is lower than what you were expecting, do the math and try to see, oh, that's because they contributed this amount to my 401k and this was an insurance deduction. But these are just some things to keep in mind.
Yep. And if anything in your contract isn't right, don't sign it. Make sure that you get clarification with the recruiter, get them to change it to whatever you agreed upon before you ever sign it. Don't just sign it and say, well, that wasn't right, can you change it? Once you sign it, they don't have any obligation to change it. So just make sure that if you have any questions or anything doesn't look right to you, to get clarification from the recruiter before you ever sign it.
And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, typically the way things quite often go in travel therapy, after you've had the phone interview with the facility, you've exchanged some emails or phone calls with your recruiter about the basic logistics of the contract, the basic time, start date and date, location, and pay. Typically the way things go in travel therapy is that you will have already verbally accepted, and most companies kind of keep that as like a binding commitment as far as your relationship goes with them. Of course, legally, you're not bound to anything until you actually sign the contract. But in terms of maintaining good relationships and being professional, most recruiters take your word when you verbally agree. So just keep that in mind, because there are certain situations where we've had travelers come to us and be like, I want to back out of this contract now. All I did was say verbally that I was going to agree to it, but now I've changed my mind because I found another contract or something like that. Try not to back out of it once you've verbally agreed. If you're still unsure, if you're still interviewing for other jobs, or you're still keeping your options open or something like that, then just don't verbally agree yet. Just say, I'm going to wait and see. Don't verbally agree with the expectation that you know you might still back out. However, if you verbally agreed and you did intend to commit to it, but you get to the written contract and there's things in there that they are incorrect or aren't what you agreed to and they refuse to change it, well, then that gives you cause to say, okay, well, then I'm backing out of the contract if you don't change what we verbally agreed to.
Yeah.
So there are situations where, yes, you do have cause to back out of it at that point, but don't do it just because you were like kind of keeping your options open or something like that. Like, don't take it lightly to back out of a contract at this point, but yes, technically not until you've signed the written agreement are you legally bound.
Yep. All right, if anybody has any questions on Instagram or Facebook about contracts or about travel therapy in general, feel free to ask those now. I think, yeah. Joel said that when he worked part-time the last 2 weeks, his company paid his stipends at a prorated rate. I'd be interested, Joel, if you're still in here, was it actually a prorated amount that they put in the contract or in your paycheck, or was it like they paid you the stipends and then there was a fee that they charged to offset the part-time hours that you worked? But yes, that's very common. I think we only know of one company anymore that guarantees stipends. Like I said, it puts a lot of liability on the company, because what some people were doing back when it was more common to have guaranteed stipends, people would take a contract for 40 hours, they would have guaranteed stipends, they would call in sick 2 days per week or something and still expect to get all of their stipends. So say you're only making $20 an hour and you're getting $1,000 a week in stipends, well, you're only missing $300 or so if you call in sick 2 days and you're still getting your stipends. So people were really taking advantage of that situation, calling in sick, still getting their stipends, and putting the companies in a very bad situation because they're now losing money on your contract. You're only working 24, but they're paying you like you're working 40 basically. So people took advantage of that, and of course that's why things change usually.
Yeah, and for anybody listening that's newer to travel therapy, when Jared mentioned earlier that we've worked part-time contracts, that's certainly not typical. And then where Joel said that his last 2 weeks of his contract decided to only work part-time, these are kind of one-off situations. Most contracts are going to be full-time hours, somewhere between 32 and 40 hours a week. But there are certain situations where you might negotiate with the facility to work a part-time contract, and that would definitely be reflected in your pay, but it's not the norm by any means.
Yep.
Bianca says on Instagram, thank you so much for this invaluable information. You're so welcome, Bianca. I'm really glad to hear that it was helpful. And we'll check and see if there's any other questions.
And then I guess the other thing that goes kind of along with contracts, if you haven't watched any of our stuff ever, we very often harp on this because it's so important, but we've talked so much in here about the interview with the facility, and that's because the interview is so important. And like Whitney said earlier, she mentioned this, but we didn't really point it out too much. But like if a facility says we expect 90% productivity, you really want to follow up with that and make sure that they're lenient on that there's some situations where there's no way you can get 90%. If there's like some crazy things that happen throughout the day, you need to follow up with them and make sure that they're going to be lenient in that type of situation. So you want to have these in-depth interviews where you're asking them a lot of questions, following up, making sure that it's a good fit for you, because you're not going to get any other information about this clinic except what you ask in the interview. So really make sure that your interview is thorough, and that you look over your contract very thoroughly as well and clarify anything that needs to be clarified. But that's probably the most important part of traveling, is the interview, making sure it's a good fit. Because if you go into the interview and they say 90%, you're like, okay, that sounds okay. And then you go through the whole process and then you're getting your pay prorated and all that stuff. It's a disaster. So just be careful with that stuff.
On Instagram, someone asked, how would you go about following up and making sure that they're going to be lenient on it? So part of this is just a verbal agreement, that a discussion that you're having with the manager during the interview. Definitely recommend going back and watching our videos about the interview and questions to ask. It's important. We recently talked about, for example, there's some facilities that are moving away from wanting to do interviews, and they're just kind of exchanging basic information via email, just giving you the basic facts. We find it so valuable to have a half an hour or an hour-long conversation with a manager to really dig a little deeper into the way the facility is going to run and just get a feel for if that manager sounds reasonable or not. And then basically, quite often it will happen that you will arrive at the facility and the things will be a little different than what you agreed to. Just like someone else said earlier on the video, they say they're going to only schedule you 12, but then you get there and they start scheduling you 20. Well, you want to be able to reference back that conversation that you had with that manager of, hey, remember when we discussed this is what we agreed to. So if possible, try to get it in writing that this is what you agreed to, or just reference back to that conversation. But there definitely are situations where they'll try to push you beyond what was kind of discussed.
Especially if you never follow up about it. If you ask what the caseload is and they tell you something and you don't even try to inquire any further, then you can get situations for sure where they try to push the boundaries. And even us, with all the experience that we have, we get in those situations too. And it's always an awkward conversation to be like, on the phone you said 12 patients per day maximum. I don't want to be scheduled 16 patients. So you just have to be careful. Definitely at least have the conversation so you can fall back on that. But otherwise, they're just going to be like, oh, well, that's what we do here. And so, yeah.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, you just have to lean back on, explaining, I'm not comfortable with this. This is jeopardizing my patient care. This is jeopardizing me as a clinician. I'm not okay with this, just fall back on that, because ultimately it's your license, it's your reputation as a clinician, it's your work-life balance. You need to stand up for yourself in those situations. Something where we've had it be tricky before is where, say we interviewed with a regional manager or someone who wasn't our direct supervisor at the clinic, and then when we get to the clinic, our direct supervisor is not as lenient or not following the same guidelines that was discussed. So if at all possible, even if they make you have an interview with the regional or some higher up person, try to see if you can have a phone call one-on-one with your direct manager to make sure that you're on the same page as well.
Yeah, and you can just say things like, oh, I talked to Michael and he said that I'd only be seeing 12. Is that what you normally see in the clinic? Is that going to work for you? Just verify that the information you got is actually what's going to work for them at that clinic.
Yeah, and you don't have to You don't have to say anything in regards to like, I'm not a good enough clinician to see this many people. You can just say, you know, I'm not comfortable. I know that it's going to jeopardize my patient care. If I have to, you know, try to meet 90%, that's not realistic in my experience. You know, don't degrade your value as a clinician by any means to say that you're not up for the workload. I know sometimes, especially as a newer graduate, or if you're newer to a setting, you might feel like that. You might feel like, oh gosh, maybe I'm just not a good enough clinician because I can't meet 90%. No, it's not realistic. All these companies just push the boundaries, push. No one can really meet 90% or see 20 patients in a day in outpatient while maintaining good patient care. It's just not realistic. But of course, what we do as healthcare professionals is tied to productivity, unfortunately, because of the way that we're reimbursed from insurance companies. So these companies will just keep trying to push. You have to stand up for yourself as a clinician.
Yep.
All right, so I think we'll wrap up here. If there's no more questions, I know earlier Joel had asked about our trip to Colorado. We're starting in Denver. He asked where we're going. We're starting in Denver, and then we're going to see some friends in Colorado Springs, and then we're making a little loop. So we're gonna rent a car, drive down to Colorado Springs, drive over to see some friends in Durango. We're stopping in Aspen and Glenwood Springs, and then back to Denver. So we'll kind of be all over the state.
Yep. It's going to be a weird road trip for us now with Whitney pregnant, though. Normally we do a lot of hiking and stuff, but she's still been hiking, but we're worried about hiking at elevation and how that would go. So we're probably not going to do any crazy national park hiking or anything, but we'll probably still do some outdoor stuff for sure.
Yeah, we're hoping to see what's it called, the Maroon Bells. We haven't seen that yet, and near Aspen, but probably do some of the easier hikes just because of the altitude there, and then also the heat has really been bothering me during pregnancy, so that's been hard. And hopefully it won't be quite as hot in Colorado as it has been here in Virginia, but I still think it's gonna be quite warm. But maybe once we get up into the higher elevations it won't be. But yeah, it should still be a really fun trip, so follow along on Instagram if you want to see some of our pictures from our trip. And as always, please reach out to us if you have questions. You can send us a message on Facebook, on Instagram. You can use our contact form on our website at traveltherapymentor.com to shoot us an email. Happy to answer any questions you have. But again, if you guys are just now getting into travel therapy and learning about all this stuff, please dive into our content, dive into our podcast. Use the search bar on our website to find the topic that you're looking for. It's most likely that we've written an article or done a video on it in the past.
Yep. All right. Yeah. Last thing, enter that Instagram giveaway too if you want to win an Apple Watch. That will be closing tomorrow.
Yep. All right, guys. Thank you so much for those of you that tuned in. Again, hit that thumbs up button if you learned something, and we'll chat with you later.
Yep. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.